Hello, this is part two of Our Revolution Summed Up by the International Communist Party of 1967. This section is mostly talking about the political struggles of the revolution within, like, the intermediate classes, such as the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry, as well as much of the political struggles of the insurrection and what followed. So there's a lot of quotes in this section. Most of them are from the State and Revolution. So this text does get backed by much of Lenin's texts, as well as a little bit of Trotsky, as they were both contributing to the International in writing the International's thesis, I would assume. I don't exactly know what they're quoting at some points, but if you're following along on either intcp.org or international-communist-party.org, I essentially see both of these sites as just archives at this point. At the end of each section, you should see some footnotes, maybe that include information on the quotes. I intend to finish this text, so keep in tune, maybe ring a bell or whatever if you have troubles reading alone. Also, I'm willing to answer any questions on the text, although my understanding is limited, obviously, right now because I haven't finished it yet. Thanks for listening. October would be born in the fracas of these constantly repeated and amplified proclamations that announced the opening of an irreversible and global cycle of revolutions led by those who were still called social democrats, but who would soon get rid of their soiled shirt to take the name of communists. An exception, October, a breach in the rule to peaceful accession to power, the exclusive achievement of a single proletariat, one of the few, moreover, for which it might seem that an exception would be rightly possible given the particular conditions of its struggle? No, the triumph of the general rule, the victory of universal and invariable guidelines, clearly defined in advance. On what is the ignominious legend of non-revolutionary paths, or worse still, the "national paths to socialism" based? There is no doubt that history prohibits backward countries from passing over by their own means the degrees of economic development that lead to full socialism, and that of the developed countries have already passed through. This, however, can only be one particular aspect of a historical fact determined by global relations, and which therefore has nothing national about it. Is it then a question at first of laying only the "foundations" of socialism? That is to say, of raising society from the lowest economic level, represented by pre-capitalist or even patriarchal structures, to the highest level, that is to full capitalism? Here too, here again, history knows no other way than revolution. The iron dictatorship of the proletariat, leading the peasants, anti-democratism and pro-internationalism, Lenin who, in Zimmerwald and in Kienthal, in imperialism and in countless writings of the war period, constantly returned with all of his power to the vital and urgent task to, quote, transform the imperialist war into civil war, unquote. This Lenin who so harshly criticized pacifist illusions, who worked feverishly for the birth of a new international based on those principles. This Lenin who embraced and always associated the revolutions of the West and the East, and who showed the proletariat everywhere and its party in every country the path to the revolutionary conquest of power. Whatever the immediate economic program imposed by objective conditions, would this Lenin be really the father of, quote, peaceful and national paths to socialism, the theorist of, quote, peaceful existence, and not their deadly enemy? Would the Lenin of the military program of proletarian revolution therefore be the leader of marches for peace, the respectful defender of national and democratic values. In sum, would this Lenin have been the first to betray Red October? We will not be able to follow step by step the backstory of the few months that separated Lenin's return to Russia in April 17 and the dazzling victory in October. Moreover, many texts and meetings of our party have already been devoted to this subject. However, it is important to identify the broad outlines which will extend beyond the event, emphasizing the general scope of their lessons learned. The main stages are known, from the April theses to the party conference of the same month, from the first Pan-Russian Congress of the Soviets to the July days, from the clandestine Sixth Congress in July to the struggle against Kornilov in August. The party's intense vigil, devoted both to the restoration of the Marxist doctrine, see the State and Revolution, and to the struggle against the resistance to insurrection, manifested in the Central Committee itself. From the insurrection, through the boycott of Kerensky's pre-parliament, to the seizure of power and the constitution of the Council of People's Commissars, from the first major decrees to the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, from the Peace of Brest-Litovsk to the liquidation of the residue of the alliance with the left socialist revolutionaries, and through to the start of the Civil War on all fronts. In these few months that put to an end the whole phase of history, 2 entire decades, and that would in their turn weigh heavily on the decades to come. Where can we look for the lessons of the proletarian communist October? In the revolutionaries' economic program, in its authoritarian interventions in the field of production and exchange? No, in a series of texts published before and after the insurrection, and up to the famous speech on the tax and kind of 1921, Lenin would never stop repeating, on behalf of the Bolsheviks, that these measures were intended to move backward Russia to fully developed capitalism, or to express it more positively, to build the quote, foundations of socialism at the cost of a bitter struggle against petty bourgeois, rural, and urban microproduction, the outcome of which depended on the extension of the proletarian revolution to the countries of developed capitalism, concealed nothing of the difficulties to be overcome, conceded nothing to the demagogy of unfeasible promises within Russia alone, and fits perfectly within the Marxist tradition. It is enough to reread the Manifesto of 1848 or the Address of 1850 to be convinced. Besides, there is no reason to suppose that the application of another program would have been possible or even desirable, nor therefore that this one was too modest, as certain militants, carried away by their revolutionary enthusiasm, could believe at the time. However, it is not the economic program that we will find the proletarian and communist mark of October. The spark that would ignite the proletarian masses of the whole world in the burning years of the first post-war, because taken in itself it in no way indicates the universal path of workers' emancipation. By realizing it, the victorious proletarian power was working to consolidate itself while waiting for the European, or at least European Communist Revolution, to come to free Russia from its backwardness, and to cut its Gordian knot, thanks to a massive contribution of the productive forces and technological resources wrested from developed capitalism. Once the land had been nationalized, an attempt of collaborative work, industry, as well as its financial and commercial apparatus should first be controlled, then forced to concentrate, forced cartelization, and finally merged by the state, which intended to use it as a political weapon, even more than as an economic one, to accelerate the evolution of the countryside and prepare itself in the event of further delay in the external revolution to face the inevitable conflict with the peasantry alone. It was only after having severed the vital links that tied this economic program to the political program, the Communist Party's global dictatorship, and physically liquidated the party itself through state repression, that Stalinism was able to develop not only a quote economic capitalism, but also a quote political capitalism. It fashioned a great nation from the Russia of October and guardians of democracy and order out of revolutionary parties. It threw them into the furnace of the Second Imperialist War to defend the very foundations of capital. The USSR of peaceful coexistence was built out of this political rupture and the exploitation of the economic foundations hard won by the revolution. This victory of the counter-revolution alone allowed the international bourgeoisie to commemorate an October that had been so effectively sterilized that it could take its place in the palace of culture, integrating itself into the common heritage, hovering above classes that would become history. In short, an October of which nothing remains, but we know that the true October may well reappear from this void sooner than we thought, in all its strength and brilliance. This strength and this brilliance are so well concealed from the exploited class that it foresees no other future than the endless agony of today's decadent bourgeois society. However, they should emerge clearly from a faithful and complete portrait of the Revolution, including the economic measures taken in the years 1917 to 21, appropriately placed within their historical framework and with their true meaning. From the April Theses to the foundation of the Third International, the political line defended by the Bolshevik Party forms a flawless whole. In its relentless struggle, the party got rid of any element, even purely formal, that might have led one to believe that there was some link between democracy and socialism. Quote, the term democracy is not only scientifically incorrect when applied to a communist party, it has now, since March 1917, simply become a blindfold on the eyes of the revolutionary people, and preventing them from boldly and freely, on their own initiative, building up the new, the Soviets of workers, peasants, and all other deputies, as the sole power in the state, and as the harbinger of the quote, withering away of the state in every form, unquote. The party, and the international with it, would be entirely communist. After the collapse of Tsarism had thrown it first into a revolutionary situation, the Bolshevik Party was plainly aware of the international responsibilities that this historical privilege had handed to it. Quote, but to whom much is given, of him much is required. It is we who must found and right now, without delay, a new revolutionary proletarian international, or rather, we must not fear to acknowledge publicly that this new international is already established and operating. This is the international of those, quote, internationalists indeed. They, and they alone, are representatives of the revolutionary internationalist mass, and not their corruptors, unquote. The fact that these communist internationalists were so few in number did not scare him. Quote, it is not a question of numbers, but of giving correct expression to the ideas and policies of the truly revolutionary proletariat. The point is not to proclaim internationalism, but to be able to be an internationalist indeed, even when times are most trying, unquote. If a combination of historical circumstances, independent of the will of the bourgeoisie, since they are imposed on it by the inevitable march of the class struggle, makes Russia a country that is more free than others, quote, let us make use of this freedom, not to advocate support for the bourgeoisie or bourgeois revolutionary defensism, but in a bold, honest, proletarian, Liebknecht way to found the Third International, an international uncompromisingly hostile both to the social chauvinist traitors and the vacillating centrists. Unquote. This duty to the international proletariat always comes to the fore in the consciousness of the party, which considered it to be its main task. It was to endow the new international with a Marxism restored in its revolutionary integrity and enhanced by the victories of Petrograd and Moscow. The state and revolution and October are contemporary. Lenin's The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, and Trotsky's Terrorism and Communism sum up the theoretical and practical assessment of 3 years of civil war. The theses of the first and second Congresses of the International broadcast the message to proletarians of the whole world, not from the Russian party as such, but from Marxism as a whole, for which the dynamics of the class war formed once again a pole of attraction for all exploited classes around the world. To evoke the events of 1917 properly, we would need the pen of a Trotsky. But what we simply want to demonstrate is that the contours of October were already taking shape well before the victory of the insurrections, in the writings, the speeches, the theses, and the struggles of the Bolshevik Party. Because October includes not only the Civil War and the foundation of the Communist International and its first congresses, but the NEP, not only the victory but also the counter-revolution, not only the events in Russia, but the world events linked to them. The Bolshevik Party did not throw itself blindly into the revolution. It did not expect the movement of the masses to solve the enigmas of history and to show it the path to follow, or the goal to achieve. On the contrary, for it, October was the end point that had been planned, expected, prepared, and announced daily to the masses by word and action, an end point that would become a starting point. The February Revolution handed power from the bloody hands of Tsarism to those of the bourgeoisie, eager to dip them in the same blood, but at the same time it created, together with the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies in Petrograd, a "power based not on the law, but directly on the force of the armed masses." Unquote. Since two powers cannot coexist for long within the same state, what kept them entangled in Russia? What caused the Petrograd Soviet to "hand over state power to the bourgeoisie and its provisional government" when it held it? The gigantic petty bourgeois wave, replies Lenin. It, has swept over everything and overwhelmed the class-conscious proletariat, not only by force of numbers but also ideologically. That is, it has infected and imbued very wide circles of workers with the petty bourgeois political outlook. Unquote. The epidemic, we should add, had even reached a fraction of the Bolshevik Party. In October, this second stage of the revolution, which, according to the April theses, must give power to the proletariat and the poor section of the peasants, would only be possible by, pouring of vinegar and bile into the sweet water of revolutionary democratic phraseology, and, curing the proletariat of the general petty bourgeois intoxication, This is the break that prevents the seething masses from following their path, the possibility for the enemy to stem the rising tide of quote, of the proletariat and the poorest section of the peasants, unquote. While it also holds in reserve the weapon of direct bourgeois repression, a purely Russian experience, a national phenomenon, not in the slightest. Having behind it 3/4 of a century of proletarian struggles, with Marx's and Engels' records of class struggles in Germany and France, the Bolshevik Party could affirm on the eve of October, and for any October to come, that, quote, the worldwide experience of bourgeois and landowner governments has evolved two methods of people keeping in subjection. The first is violence. Nicholas Romanov I, nicknamed Nicholas of the Big Stick, and Nicholas II, the Bloody, demonstrated to the Russian people the maximum of what can and cannot be done in the way of these hangmen's practices. But there is another method, best developed by the British and the French bourgeoisies, who, quote, learned their lesson in a series of great revolutions and revolutionary movements of the masses. It is the method of deception, flattery, fine phrases, promises by the million, petty sops and concessions of the unessential while retaining the essential, unquote. The lesson is permanent and universal. The proletarian revolution cannot win without crushing the insidious enemy of petty bourgeois ideology, rooted in urban and rural microproduction. The leaders of the petty bourgeoisie must, it is a fact determined by real class relations, teach the proletariat to trust the bourgeoisie. Proletarians must teach the people to distrust it. This is the first lesson that the Communist International would learn. 50 years later, it is directed against you commemorator gravediggers. The ditch dug by October separated the proletariat not only from the bourgeoisie, but from all the intermediate classes. This is where the Russian Revolution manifested its proletarian and communist character. This is where it belongs to us and condemns the parties, tendencies, or men who delight in the sweet water of democratic phraseology, which today is no longer in the least revolutionary. That is why, in August 1918, the Bolsheviks could proclaim, quote, our revolution began as world revolution, unquote. And that is why we can repeat this 50 years later. In the great jolt given by the April Theses, Lenin first of all asserts that under a new bourgeois democratic regime, the war, quote, unquestionably remains on Russia's part a predatory imperialist war, unquote, from which one cannot escape without, quote, overthrowing capital, unquote. To this end, defeatism must be spread in the ranks of the army, fraternization must be encouraged across borders, imperialist war must be transformed into civil war, quote, for objectively the problem of the war can only be solved in a revolutionary way, unquote. Again, what was stopping the masses from understanding this? Lenin replies, quote, revolutionary defensism must be regarded as the most important, the most striking manifestation of the petty bourgeois wave that has swept over nearly everything. It is the worst enemy of the further progress and success of the Russian Revolution, unquote. Participation in the, quote, defense of the country, unquote, under the pretext that democratic conquests are threatened, petty bourgeois dreams of agreement between belligerent governments calls for goodwill, quote, internationalism in word, and cowardly opportunism and fawning on the socialist chauvinists indeed, unquote. Wishful thinking about disarmament, the Bolshevik critique fell pitilessly upon the whole, quote, reign of petty bourgeois phrasemongering, full of good intentions, unquote. For Lenin, the social chauvinists and their lackeys from the center represent an objective phenomenon. They defend bourgeois domination directly or indirectly, and if the revolution has already taken its first step, it must now pass to the second. That is, to give state power to the proletariat, which alone can, quote, ensure the end of the war, unquote. He adds, quote, this will be the beginning of a breakthrough on a worldwide scale, a breakthrough in the front of capitalist interests, and only by breaking through on this front can the proletariat save mankind from the horrors of war and endow it with the blessings of a durable peace, unquote. Pacifism has no place in the October program. War on war, by all means of revolutionary defeatism, until the revolutionary conquest of state power, only then, if, quote, the global front of capital, unquote, has been broken down, will peace prevail. The Bolshevik struggle against the pretexts invoked by the ever-reviving petty bourgeois ideology to drag the proletariat into the imperialist massacre would continue to deepen and increase between February and October. The party made immense and unceasing efforts to convince the proletariat that it was necessary to take power, if only to put an end to the terrible hemorrhage of the World War. And it was with eyes focused on this global solution that the proletarian power, the Communist Party, would sign in March 1918 the quote, incredibly heavy and humiliating unquote, peace of Brest-Litovsk, its Treaty of Tilsit. For it, if it signed, it was not for pacifism, but in the name of international proletarian revolution. If the revolution had broken out in Europe under the impetus of October, it would not even have had to do it. But since it was forced to do so, it consented to the infamous peace with the certainty that whatever the sacrifices imposed, its withdrawal from the imperialist war would not only strengthen the ties forged between the proletarian dictatorship and the masses in Russia, but would throw the ferment of defeatism into the imperialist armies, still struggling in Europe. It also consented to it, quote, in the interest of a serious preparation, unquote, for the Revolutionary War, the necessity of which it had long been recognized, whether it be defensive and imposed by the foreseeable and even inevitable attack of the foreign bourgeoisies, not yet dispossessed of power by the revolution, or whether it be offensive and unleashed by the first proletarian state against the capitalist powers that surround it with the aim of coming to the aid of proletarians who are already insurgent or on the point of rebelling against capital. Before and after the conquest of power, not the slightest trace of pacifism in the October program. In the report on War and Peace in March 1918, Lenin would proclaim, quote, we should have but one slogan, to learn the art of war properly, unquote, and addressing comrades impatient to leave for the front of global revolutionary war, quote, grasp even an hour's respite if it is given to you, in order to maintain contact with the remote rear and there create new armies, unquote. In the Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, he would define in a magnificent dialectical precis the two inseparable phrases on the revolutionary conquest and exercise of power, quote, not a single great revolution has ever taken place or can ever take place without the disorganization of the army. The first commandment of every victorious revolution, as Marx and Engels repeatedly emphasized, was to smash the old army, dissolve it, and replace it by a new one, unquote. And let no one tell us that this was only an internal civil war. For Lenin, the Civil War, just as much as the Revolution, is an international event, which knows no border and does not tolerate being abandoned, even if it can accept truces. The Bolsheviks illustrated in the immense scope of the October Revolution in advance by exhuming the Marxist doctrine of the state from under the dust where the reformists had forgotten it. Today's commemorator grave diggers have not completely forgotten this fact, so they go to great lengths to erase from the memory of the proletariat all vestiges of the great Marxist texts and the masterful lesson of revolutionary struggles. The Bolsheviks took the same historic route as the Communards, the one that Marx and Engels had always advocated for before, during, and after the Paris Commune, the guiding path, the only path that communists recognize, whatever their country or generation. It is certainly not by chance that the April theses assigned to the party, which must become itself again by stripping itself of its soiled shirt, the task of redefining its program, especially with regards to its quote, attitude toward the state and our demand for the commune state, unquote. This had to be done so that the historical absurdity of the duality of power disappeared, and that, finally freed from the shackles of petty bourgeois phraseology, thanks to the decisive influence of the party, the Soviet found the strength to openly cut off the ruling class, to proclaim not only no support for the provisional government, but above all, no parliamentary republic. It was necessary for the Soviet to accept that it must become, quote, the sole power of the state, a power not based on any law, but on arming of the masses. It was then to become very clear that there was no need to dwell for a single moment on the hope of a gradual transition from the first stage to the second, that such an evolution was ruled out, and that it was a matter of making a qualitative leap, since it was necessary to smash the machinery of the bourgeois state and build another, a state just as dictatorial as the old one, but of a proletarian nature, a class state, like the bourgeois state, but disdaining to conceal its nature. Unlike the latter, a state intended to repress the enemy class, just as the bourgeois class has always done, without ever willingly admitting to it, whereas the proletarians will do it and will say it. Among lures of high culture, hasn't this leaped forward? The armed insurrection and dictatorial exercise of power, in other words, the suppression of pure democracy, of the bourgeoisie, been imposed on Russia because of its historical, geographical, or even racial particularities? It's Russia, right? Russia. Couldn't we take another path elsewhere? Well, no. In this month of intense struggle where history relentlessly put the Bolshevik Central Committee on notice to take responsibility, the state and revolution definitively answered this question. 1. Quote, the supersession of the bourgeois state by the proletarian state is impossible without a violent revolution. Unquote. 2. Quote, the theory on the class struggle applied by Marx to the question of the state and of the socialist revolution leads of necessity to the recognition of the political rule of the proletariat, of its dictatorship, i.e., of power undivided with anyone else, and relying directly upon the armed force of the masses. Unquote. Quote, Marx's theory of the state, in other words, the proletariat organized as the ruling class, is inseparably bound up with the whole of his doctrine of the revolutionary role of the proletariat in history. The culmination of this rule is the proletarian dictatorship, the political rule of the proletariat. But since the proletariat needs the state as a special form of organization of violence against the bourgeoisie, the following conclusion suggests itself. Is it conceivable that such an organization can be created without first abolishing, destroying the state machine created by the bourgeois for themselves? Unquote. 3. Further, or 3, quote, further, The essence of Marx's theory of the state has been mastered only by those who realize that the dictatorship of a single class is necessary not only for every class society in general, not only for the proletariat, which has overthrown the bourgeoisie, but also for the entire historical period which separates capitalism from classless society, from communism. Bourgeois states are most varied in form, but in their essence is the same. All these states, whatever their form, are in the final analysis inevitably the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The transition from capitalism to communism is certainly bound to yield a tremendous abundance in a variety of political forms, but the essence will inevitably be the same, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Unquote. The demand for the dictatorship of the proletariat for an entire historical period, far from being a subjective claim of this class, is only the translation of an objective requirement insofar as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are the only protagonists in the drama of contemporary history. Quote, the overthrow of bourgeois rule can be accomplished only by the proletariat, the particular class whose economic conditions of existence prepare it for this task and provide it with the possibility and the power to perform it. While the bourgeoisie break up and disintegrate the peasantry and all the petty bourgeois groups, they weld together, unite, and organize the proletariat. Only the proletariat, by virtue of the economic role it plays in large-scale production, is capable of being the leader of all the working and exploited people whom the bourgeoisie exploit, oppress, and crush, often not less but more than they do the proletarians, but who are incapable of waging an independent struggle for their own emancipation. The proletariat needs state power, a centralized organization of force, an organization of violence both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to lead the enormous mass of the population, the peasants, the petty bourgeoisie, and semi-proletarians, in the work of organizing a socialist economy. Unquote. This passage is crucial. All the experience of the months preceding October shows that the petty bourgeoisie necessarily slows down the upward movement of the revolution. It was under its insidious influence that the Soviet, quote, the only possible form of revolutionary government, unquote, had been retreating since February from the task entrusted to it by history, to take and exercise all power without sharing it with anyone else. And this experience has a general value. It is a fact of social mechanics, destined to play out everywhere, the dangerous pitfall that threatens any communist revolution. Quote, now, after the experience of July 17, it is the revolutionary proletariat that must independently take over state power. Without that, the victory of the revolution is impossible. Unquote. Lenin had written a few months earlier, showing that if the communists remained, quote, in favor of building the whole state on the model of Soviets, unquote, it could not be the, quote, present Soviets, not organs collaborating with the bourgeoisie, unquote, that emerged from the new revolution. By virtue of this need to lead the masses dictatorially, October would be the totalitarian and violent seizure of power by the party based on the armed forces of the working class, the liquidation of all democratic and parliamentary fiction, with the first boycott of pre-parliament, and second, the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, despotic intervention in the economy, and the construction of an army on the ruins of the democratic Tsarist army. In this respect, too, the hand that was writing the state and revolution would leave the pamphlet unfinished in order to grasp the rudder of the insurrection. It would have been futile to trace the revolutionary path in theoretical texts in order not to follow it, when the time came in the reality of class struggle. Victor or vanquished, it is through combat that we prepare for the future. January 1918. Quote, the final victory of socialism in a single country is of course impossible, unquote. Hairs of Stalinism shudder. But here is what is possible, quote, a living example. Tackling the job somewhere in one country is more effective than any proclamations and conferences. This is what inspires the working people in all countries, unquote. In July 1918, when the conflagration of the Civil War cast its first glimmers, quote, when we came to power, our task as the Proletarian Communist Party, at a time when the capitalist bourgeois rule still remained in the other countries, our immediate task, I repeat, was to retain that power, that torch of socialism, so that it might scatter as many sparks as possible to add to the growing flames of global revolution, unquote. This is what October teaches us, and you would prefer, oh, commemorator gravediggers, October to mean nothing more than the development of fair trade, of peaceful coexistence, the path of least resistance to what you call socialism. You would like this living example to be buried forever in the soil of Russia from 1917 to 18. Lead the masses. Lead them first in the insurrectionary conquest of power by the Soviets, hardened and purified by struggle. Then lead them in the gigantic fight against, quote, the resistance of the exploiters, who cannot at once be deprived of their wealth, of their advantages of organization and knowledge, and consequently for a fairly long period will inevitably try to overthrow the hated rule of the poor, unquote. And against the weight of tradition, habits, the stubborn influence of petty bourgeois ideology came creeping into every pore of a society that is going through a painful transformation. Lead them how? It is not enough to educate, but also it is necessary to neutralize and repress the forces of the past that constantly resurface and threaten the future. You must be aware that, quote, every great revolution, and a socialist revolution in particular, even if there is no external war, is inconceivable without internal war, i.e., civil war, which is even more economically devastating than external war, and involves thousands and millions of cases of wavering and desertion from one side to another, implies a state of extreme indefiniteness, disequilibrium, and chaos, unquote. See note 32. You must rule dictatorially because, quote, of course, all of the elements of disintegration of the old society, which are inevitably very numerous and connected mainly with the petty bourgeoisie, because it is the petty bourgeoisie that every war and every crisis ruins and destroys first, are bound to reveal themselves during such a profound revolution. To put these down requires time and requires an iron hand, unquote. This is the great lesson of Red October, the relentless battle on all fronts of the war unleashed by the internal and external counter-revolution, by the national and international bourgeoisie, must be accompanied by a dictatorial control of the part of a single class over the, quote, elements of disintegration that are constantly born or reborn from the deep within the intermediate classes, those rejects of a dead history that cling desperately to living history, threatening to drag it to rock bottom. For all these reasons, without being able to omit a single one of them, Lenin would say in his polemic against Kautsky that, quote, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is a power conquered and maintained by violence, which the proletariat exercises over the bourgeoisie, power which is not bound by any law, unquote. Consequently, quote, the indispensable characteristic, the necessary condition of dictatorship is the forcible suppression of the exploiters as a class, and consequently the suppression of pure democracy. In other words, of equality and freedom in regard to that class, unquote. The October Revolution would not only deprive the bourgeois of all political rights, but would impose on the rural petty bourgeois inferior rights to that of the proletariat. For all of these reasons, and even without external war, the necessary Red Terror is the political manifestation of the proletarian dictatorship. It means of intervention its means of intervention in economic and social relations, its instrument of military action. For all of these reasons, common to all countries, the dictatorship of the proletariat implies the existence of the political party. Hegemony of the proletariat, hegemony of the party. The two terms are inseparable. Just as in the manifesto, the organization of, quote, the proletariat as the ruling class is inconceivable without the, quote, organization of the proletariat into a class and consequently into a political party, unquote. The story of October is that of two inverse processes, whose points of contact are so many bloody clashes. As the masses moved away from the provisional government, deserted their front, clashed on the street with the police, pushed for insurgency, demanded power with guns rather than ballot papers. The parties that claimed to be of the working class but reflected the hesitations, the cowardice, the servility of the petty bourgeoisie aligned themselves one after the other on the side of parliamentary democracy and war. Conversely, the party, which since April had proclaimed the urgency of breaking this accursed front, and was acting effectively for the conquest of power in the name of, quote, the proletariat and the poor strata of the peasantry, unquote, appeared more and more on the political and social scene as the only party for the revolution and the dictatorship. After the showdown of the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, this party only had one last possible remaining ally, the left Socialist Revolutionaries. The Peace of Brest-Litovsk would break this alliance, and in the Civil War up to Kronstadt and beyond, the proletarian power would come up against the democratic, popular, centrifugal, or anarchist resurgences of the old groups or parties with each step, and would sweep them away in its forward march. This settling of political and social forces was not a new phenomenon. In their study of class struggles in France and Germany, Marx and Engels had already shown for the enlightenment of the revolutionary proletariat and its party that it is inevitable that the groups and parties defending the intermediate classes and embodying their economic interests, habits, and ideology gradually pass to the enemy. The greatness of the Bolsheviks lies precisely in the fact that for the first time in history of the workers' movement, they drew from this harsh negative lesson a positive force, a factor of victory. Leaving the dead to bury the dead, they accepted, magnificently alone, the responsibility of power. Nothing could make them hesitate, not even the indecision and democratic scruples of some of their comrades with a long history as communist militants who backed away from this, quote, leap into the unknown that was the insurrection. Not even the inevitable desertions, nothing caught them by surprise. They carried on regardless and consciously opened the era of the party dictatorship in the name of the class. Healthy proletarian energies had emerged from the composite magma of social forces. It was historical necessity that made the revolution of single class the revolution of a single party. The hegemony of the proletariat could not fail to translate into the hegemony of the party, which was at the time the theoretical consciousness, the organized will, the organ of the conquest and the exercise of power, and that was the victory. In September 1917, linking as ever the qualitative leaps of the Russian Revolution to the experience of the world proletarian struggle, Lenin was already writing, quote, this shameful finale of the socialist revolutionary and Menshevik parties was not fortuitous, but a consequence of the economic status of the small owners, the petty bourgeoisie, as has been repeatedly borne out by experience in Europe, unquote. Consequently, the party would lead the insurrection alone, would take power alone, Knowing that the real movement of the masses is not determined by scrutinizing the soul of parties infested by petty bourgeois inertia, or even that of mass organs born of the revolution, where the hesitations, the blind conformity, the force of habit peculiar to the old society, had every opportunity to manifest themselves. Only theory based on an analysis of past class struggles makes it possible to predict the natural disposition of class forces at the decisive hour, to know that this hour has struck, and to intervene then, not to make the revolution, but to direct it, and direct it far beyond the seizure of power, since this is only the first act of the social drama, since the enemy will not fail to raise their heads, and the party, only one party, will be needed more than ever to exercise power. In 1920, in left-wing communism and infantile disorder, Lenin would thus restore to the Western proletariat the lesson already given and enriched by the analysis of 3 years of civil war and communist dictatorship. Quote, "The dictatorship of the proletariat means a most determined and most ruthless war waged by the new class against a more powerful enemy, the bourgeoisie, whose resistance is increased tenfold by their overthrow, even if only in a single country, and whose power lies not only in the strength of international capital, the strength and durability of their international connections, but also in the force of habit, in the strength of small-scale production. Whoever brings about even the slightest weakening of the iron discipline of the party of the proletariat, especially during its dictatorship, is actually aiding the bourgeoisie against the proletariat." Repudiation of the party principle, and for Lenin this certainly means the Communist Party, and of party discipline, it all adds up to that petty bourgeois diffuseness and instability, that incapacity for sustained effort, unity, and organized action, which, if encouraged, must inevitably destroy any proletarian revolutionary movement. Unquote. The dictatorship of the proletariat is centralization and discipline, and therefore the dictatorship of the party. Trotsky would express the same idea in a concise formula that has the merit of linking this iron discipline of the party to the very foundations of real centralization, an essential aspect which our current would continually insist upon in the congresses of the Communist International, not out of academic luxury, but because it is a vital requirement of the revolutionary movement. That is to say, programmatic and organizational continuity and its organic connection to the tactics employed in opposition to the doctrinal eclecticism made even worse by the tendency to practical improvisation, which is so deeply rooted in the so-called workers' parties influenced by the petty bourgeoisie and its intelligentsia. Quote, "It is only with the aid of a party which rests upon its past history, which foresees theoretically the course of development in all of its stages, and which deduces from it, to be read with care, it deduces from the theoretical forecast of historical development, and not from the passive observation of history, which ends up with some unpredictable discovery." Continuing, "The form of action that is appropriate at a given moment. It is only with the aid of such a party that the proletariat can free itself from the need to repeat its own history, its own hesitations, its own lack of decisions, and its own mistakes." Unquote. The revolution of tomorrow must rediscover the secret, under the penalty of death, of the strength that enabled the October insurrection to triumph and the proletariat to win the Civil War. In writing the lines cited above, Lenin and Trotsky were thinking more of the terrible period of civil war than the brief phase of the insurrection or its immediate aftermath, such as the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and the break with the left socialist revolutionaries. We could thus summarize their principal lesson. When the working class presents itself on the historical scene, or worse, on the parliamentary scene, but that concerns Russia relatively little at the time, divided into several parties. The solution is not sharing power between these parties, but the liquidation of all the capitalist lackeys disguised as workers' parties, one after the other, until all power falls into the hand of one class party. The principle of the hegemony of the party is found as such in the work of Marx and Engels, and more especially in their long polemic against the anarchists who attacked the General Council of the First International. But the great strength of revolutions, even where they are finally defeated, is to bring to light and to highlight the permanent principles of the doctrine and the program. There was, therefore, nothing new in the theses on the role of the Communist Party in the proletarian revolution that the Second Congress of the Communist International adopted in 1920, at the end of the bloody civil war in Russia. The heroic struggle of the Bolshevik proletariat simply gave new weight to established principles. Quote, the Communist International rejects most decisively the view that the proletariat can carry out its revolution without having an independent political party. Every class struggle is a political struggle. The aim of this struggle, which inevitably turns into civil war, is the conquest of political power. Political power can only be seized, organized, and led by a political party, and no other way. The rise of the Soviets as the basic historical form of the dictatorship by no means decreases the leading role of the Communist Party in the proletarian revolution. In the history of the Russian Revolution, we experienced a whole period in which the Soviets marched against the proletarian party and supported the policies of the agents of the bourgeoisie. The same thing could be observed in Germany. The same thing is also possible in other countries. On the contrary, the existence of a powerful Communist Party is necessary in order to enable the Soviets to do justice to their historic tasks. A party does not simply adapt itself to the Soviets, but is in a position to make them renounce adaptations of their own to the bourgeoisie and white guard social democracy. The working class does not only need the Communist Party before and during the conquest of power, but also after the transfer of the power into the hands of the working class. The need for a political party of the proletariat will only disappear with the complete dissolution of the classes. Unquote.